Hello, class. Today I'm going to talk about Chapter 5, Part 2. We're going to get into consequences of the Roman Republic becoming an empire. We're going to talk about the fall or the beginning of the fall of the Republic. All right. Okay. I think when we last left off, I'd already discussed the Roman Empire the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic, by the end of it, is already becoming a pretty vast empire. They're already having issues with what that even means. They're even the people that start discussing imperium. What does that mean? Power over others. And some of their philosophers even have issues with this. They ask questions. Can we be a republic with citizens and have subjects? Should these new subjects become citizens? What's the process of that? And do these new subjects have equal rights in this, burgeoning empire? So these are all questions that they were already having before they became an empire in name. So let's talk about the consequences of an empire becoming an empire, specifically in the context of Rome. So we know that Rome has conquered the Carthaginians. There were 3 Punic Wars. At the very end, they totally destroyed Carthage, supposedly salt the fields. They probably don't do that because they do make a colony there eventually. And that's where they get a good amount of their grain between, go back to this right here, between the Carthaginian areas, North Africa here, also North Africa, Egypt, and Sicily. Those are their main grain producing regions for much of even the later empire. And so with these huge grain producing regions of the old Carthaginian Empire, they are going to inherit or take over hundreds of thousands, if not a million plus slaves. Also, when they start to conquer Asia Minor, they enslave or come into control of more slaves. So within probably the last 100 years, maybe 200 years of the Roman Republic, Rome is transitioning into one of the largest slave systems in history. Okay, there's probably 5 serious slave systems in history. All other kingdoms and nations were involved with slavery, but usually not to this level. Okay. So that's one of the consequences, is slavery. They had slaves before, but maybe the average wealthy person owned, 5 slaves or 10 slaves, whatever that be. And these mostly would have been household slaves, maybe some farm slaves, but they would have known these slaves, by name. Some of these slaves, most of these slaves actually would have eventually been adopted into the family. Some very elite families in Rome came from a servile class and were adopted and eventually became, important people. There wasn't really a stigma on having a slave in your ancestor in Rome, really. But now they're going to have a lot more slaves. Some of these wealthy aristocrats are going to have sometimes 2,000 to 5,000 slaves. And you can't know all the slaves. And the way that you would treat these people is going to be very different than if you had 5. All right. Some of these Carthaginian slave plantations, which they will call latifundia, will have 5,000 on one plantation. So the Carthaginians had massive slaves. They take this over, and the problem is this is going to supplant the Roman labor force largely, especially farmers. So some of these slaves are brought back into Italy, and if you're a small farmer, you can't compete with a guy who has 500 slaves or 1,000 slaves. And so a lot of these smaller farmers will end up selling their land to these wealthier men. And then, of course, they accrue more land, they put more slaves. And then a lot of these, people that would have been kind of middling class become poor. They go to the cities for work, and they're slaves doing all their jobs too. There are skilled and unskilled slaves doing just about anything you could imagine. And so the state has to do something. They have to fix something here. They're going to have like a revolution on their hands with their poor, because they've just made their poor poorer. One of the things they're going to do is create the grain dole. This is probably one of the world's first welfare systems. So if you're a Roman citizen, you had the ability to go and stand in line every day and go get either bread or grain for you and your family. This was bare minimum. I don't know if there was anything else besides just grain. But so this was just a stopgap measure. There's still going to be problems with the lower class people not having work and slaves taking their jobs. I mean, that sounds pretty sad that you'd be worse off than a slave because you might not be able to eat well. And so some of these poor people would probably sell themselves into slavery or even their children. You'll see that throughout the history of slavery too. If you're very, very poor, sometimes you would actually prefer slavery because it comes with at least food and shelter. So that's pretty sad. All right, some other things culturally they're happening. Oftentimes we think of, Rome as this decadent, I don't know, as depicted in Hollywood. If you watch almost any Hollywood movie post World War II, Romans are depicted at their height and at their most grotesque, I guess you'd say. That was not the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic was quite conservative, male and females both, very wholesome, very simple, if you will. But after these wars, they're going to start getting, in some ways connected to the global trade of the ancient world. And so styles are going to change. People are going to want more, variety in everything they do. Part of this is going to be driven by women. And this is an interesting story because after the Punic Wars, I think it was even after maybe just the second one, maybe it was the third one. So there were, many men killed in the Second Punic War, especially. And so there was a time of mourning. All the men had to have a year of mourning. The problem is they made the women be in a period of mourning for 10 years. So they're wearing black. Okay. Romans didn't wear black unless they're in mourning. So they're in mourning. They're not allowed to really doll themselves up, not do the normal daily things. They can go out and just get food, but they've got to stay calm. They can't have a good time. So they see all these new people coming in, some merchants, some slaves, some women that are from outside that are allowed to. And they see these women wearing, beautiful clothes, nice colors that they usually hadn't had get their hands on, cosmetics, jewelry, all kinds of things. And so these Roman women they look at these things and like, we want this stuff. They need to lift the mourning. And so they go to the Senate, and the men in charge at the time tell them, no. So one day the women block the Senate House and they basically have a protest and they say, we're not going to let you pass here until you lift the mourning, and that you also allow us to start, wearing foreign clothes, foreign cosmetics, all these nice things we see on, a lot of other people. We want it too. And so they will lift this. So there's kind of a women's protest, if you will. If you want to look up Cato the Elder. He would have been one of the men in charge of trying to curb the women being allowed to express themselves after the time of mourning. All right, so that's one instance. Hellenic influence, that will be largely what's coming in there too. So it's kind of funny. You'll hear some of these poets right after this happens, and they describe the cosmetics that would be like in a typical late Roman Republican woman's bag. And it sounds like, your mom or your grandma's bag. Nowadays, I'm sure we all have a grandma or an aunt that has a bag within a bag within a bag, and there's like, enough cosmetics for an entire salon in there. Some of these poets talk about that range of accoutrements for Roman women. It's kind of neat. All right, so other Hellenic influence will be religion. There are some new religions and cults that come in, especially when they're doing poorly during the Second Punic War, I believe, is when they bring in the cult of Sulla. And they feel that they'll do anything they need to do. Even during that war, that was the last time I believe they did a human sacrifice. They actually did 2 human sacrifices to appease the gods because they felt that they were losing the war. What else want to say here? So there'll be many cults. The cult of Bacchus, of course, will come in. They don't call it Bacchus. They call it Bacchus. The Greeks will call it Dionysus. This cult first comes in. There's a bunch of rumors about it, just like they will with Christianity later on. They will say that, oh no, this is a cult for slaves and for elite women to hang out with slaves, and they're very suspicious to the cult. But by the time you get into the early empire, that's one of their favorite cults. So it just took a little bit of time to accept it. So with all these conquests, all these wars of expansion, young aristocratic men are watching their elders experience what is called a triumph. Okay, and to get a triumph, puts you on another level, not just a senatorial class, not just a consul, but now you're a victorious general, and you were just put up onto, you know, the annals of history for them. And this is very important for your family, because remember that family worship, hero worship, is part of their religion as well. The problem with this triumph, to get a triumph, you have to be involved in a war that the state allowed or declared. You have to kill 5,000 people on one battlefield. Your soldiers have to acclaim you as imperator. That has to go back to the Senate. They ratify it. And then you come back from your war, right? Then you have a parade, you have a triumph. And this is a religious ceremony mixed with a, you know, a state ceremony as well. At the end of this triumph, usually there would be execution of some of the prisoners you caught, kind of like a blood sacrifice. And at the end of that triumph, the person would then get off of the chariot that pulled them through the town, and they would put down their arms, their weapons, and even their military rank, their imperium, and they would retire as a private citizen, or they were supposed to. That's one thing Caesar's not going to do when he gets to the end of the Civil War. And some of these triumphs will later be held over killing Romans, which is kind of odd. The problem with this too is not everybody can have the opportunity. All the elites can't have the opportunity to get a triumph, to have a conquest, to even go be a governor of a province. So there's a lot of competition, and there's too many competitors. That's going to be part of what is going to lead to the end of the Republic the way it does. These generals are going to start corrupting the system, if you will. Before we get there, let me get into these topics right here. So there's social struggles. So we have servile wars. These are going to be slave wars. These are definitely a consequence of accruing too many slaves too fast. As I said, you probably have, I don't know, 1 to 3 million slaves added to their slave system in about 150 to 200 years. And so they're going to have 3 slave wars. You probably all know the last one. That's Spartacus Revolt. There were 2 others that were on Sicily that were almost this large. To put this into context, 500,000 slaves in a rebellion, that's how large the Haitian rebellion was 500,000 slaves. The last one, of course, the Spartacus Revolt, it starts with gladiators, and then it's going to roll into every other type of slave and servant and shepherd, and a lot of just common poor people are going to be involved in this revolution or rebellion, if you will. The consequences of these mass revolts, after the third one, they're going to change some of the rules on either how harsh slavery was, give a light at the end of the tunnel so more slaves can be freed, manumitted. That will make other slaves work, I guess, harder or be less apt to rebel, because they can see that there is a way out. And you could purchase your way out of slavery as well during the Roman Empire. There will not be another slave revolt after the Spartacus Revolt. They do put it down harshly. They do crucify 6,000 of the slaves at the end of it. But like I said, there's also reforms that change the system onto how a slave master could treat his slaves, how many he could have in one place, and how much supervision they would need. So there we go. 3 slave wars heading towards the end of the Republic. Then you've got the social wars. Okay, the social wars are basically some of these tribes and cities that had been added to the Italian, added to the Latin Rite, basically the Roman early empire while it's still a republic, and they're still second-class citizens. They're not fully citizens yet, and they keep asking, hey, give us full status. We've fought in all these wars with you. And so they fight 3 wars, not to break away, but they like Rome and the idea of Roman citizenship so much, they fight 3 wars to be accepted as Romans. And at the end of this one, the last one, 100,000 people will be killed in this war. And finally, the Roman state will say, okay, I guess these guys really want their citizenship, so they make them citizens. Well, in the meantime of these social wars, you have these 2 social reformers, I guess you could call these guys. These are the grandsons of Scipio Africanus, of the fame of defeating Hannibal. these guys, I get, well, anyone's a controversial character, but these guys, I say controversial because they are elites who are either claiming to or do really want to help the common people or help these people with second class citizenship get full status. Also, they do want some land reform. They actually wanted to redistribute some of the land to some of the poor people. This is going to cause a problem with the Senate because these guys are going to have too many political clients. Okay. If you brought, let's say, 100,000 or 200,000 people into first class citizenship and it was your legislation, all of those people would take your family's last name and become your voting clients. Okay, so that was a threat to the Senate and to any other powerful family and faction. There are no parties, but these guys were a threat, and one by, not both together, but one at a time, they are made enemies of the state. One of them is actually clubbed to death by the Senate. And a lot of people would have seen these people, like I said, as social reformers, but some would say they're demagogues seeking power. They could be both, but you can understand how dangerous that would be to basically buy the voting power of 100,000 people and add them to your clientelia. All right. And there were, other people had done that before, but never on that scale. So these guys were treading on some dangerous water here. So they're both killed. Those ideas are not going to go away, though. Caesar and others will have some very, it's kind of hard to describe this in a modern tongue. You don't want to say like progressive ideas, but things that would seem like an elite wants to help out the common person. Okay, I can say that. So these ideas are not going to go away, and there will be land redistribution and wealth redistribution a few times under Julius Caesar and even Augustus. Okay, although they have to take it from somewhere in someone's land and usually kill people to do it. All right, so let's get into your quiz. You guys were supposed to basically pick 3 of these 5 generals and give me 2 to 3 issues, illegal things they did. There's some things that are kind of on the cusp. They're bending the rules. They're corrupting things a little bit, or they use a crises to, those are okay if you add those in there too, but there are some just straight up illegal things these guys did that will completely corrupt the system. And then when other people do the same thing and add to it, it's really going to make the Republic fall that much faster. All right, so let's get into them one by one. Let's look at Marius. Most of the things Marius does are technically legal and under times of emergency, but what he gets away with, though, is going to set precedent for all these other men to follow. Okay, so let's give you some of the details. This guy's a middle-class guy. He was not a senatorial class in his youth. He's going to earn up in the ranks in that way. All right, he's a famous general for the Draguntian War. This is a war in North Africa, and Sulla will be one of his lieutenants during this time, and that's actually where their animosity, I guess, starts right there, really over ego. Okay, because he was the commander, Marius was the commander, Sulla was the sub-commander, but Sulla ends up taking some of the what am I trying to say here? Respect or something for the end of the war. When I get to, I'll show you that too. So anyways, here's some of the things he does that are technically illegal. Well, these are illegal. He is elected to the consul 6 times more after the first time. Remember, you could be the consul for 1 year and you had to wait 10 years in between. Well, there's no way. When he dies, he's 71 years old, and he wasn't the consul when he was 10 years old. So that means he was made consul sometimes back to back. Okay, this did happen during times of emergency, and the emergency is down here, this Germanic invasion. The Cimbrian, the Teutons tribe come in. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Germans rush into the Italian peninsula and waste, like totally waste people, armies. You see 2 consuls and 10,000 legionnaires are killed. Okay, so that's a consular, well, 2 consular armies. All right, 100,000 of the Romans are killed. Eventually, Marius is brought back in. He says, "Hey, I've already been the consul. I mean, I really can't be the consul." They're like, "No, it's an emergency. We need you again. We know you're successful in war before. Come back. You're the consul. Take out the armies, defeat the enemy." And he does. So 300,000 Germans are killed by his armies. 150,000 of these Germans are enslaved. Many of these will be assimilated rather quickly, because you're going to see the Roman army be Germanified, if you will, pretty quickly. I'll get into that when I get into the empire. So the main things you're going to look at Marius is him being a consul more than you're supposed to. His reforms are technically legal, and he's really just the tail end of these reforms that have been going on probably since the Punic Wars. And this is where they've got this expanding empire. They need more soldiers. It's getting more expensive to get Roman citizens to be soldiers. They've had to buy their own armor. So the state will basically make a deal. Your full-time job will be to be a soldier. They will buy your equipment. But since it's your full-time job, they're going to be more highly trained, okay? They take the landless, poor, and some non-citizens. They're allowed to join the army, the military, okay? And after these wars, like the Jurguntian War and others, the soldiers that served well or were at their time limit of retirement would be given land. And if they were non-citizens, they'd be given citizenship, okay? Well, here's where it starts to get kind of dicey here too. When you earn citizenship at the end of your term, the general that was in charge, or who basically went back to the Senate and got those names ratified, and you're talking about, this might be sometimes thousands of men that earn their citizenship. This guy goes back home, goes to the Senate, and pushes this legislation to make them citizens. Well, they all take his last name. They all become his political clients. And when he needs to get voted in next time, or one of his friends needs to get voted next time, he just calls in that favor, if you will. So he's the patron, they're the client. You have to understand political clientage and patronage to understand Roman politics. And as I said, there's no parties, there's factions, and men will jump from faction to faction to faction all the time. It's what suits them or their family personally. That's the part. There's no parties. So anyways, the soldier then starts to become more loyal to the generals, okay, and less so to the state. So there's Marius. Getting into Sulla, as I said, Sulla was one of his lieutenants in the Jurguntian War, but he is going to basically steal some of the thunder. He's the one that captures King Jugurtha, and when they go back, a lot of people give him the credit for the ending of the war, even though it was not him in full command. He serves in the Cimbric Wars and Social Wars. Then he's going to be elected to take on the Mithridatic Wars. Okay, these are wars happening in Asia Minor. I think I talked about that last time a little bit. But anyways, so he's given the command legally. The Senate gives the command with 5 legions. Marius goes in though and has some tribunes veto that and give him the command. So even though Sulla's going to do some bad things here, Marius is starting to bend and break rules to take these guys' power away. Mind you, these guys are getting pretty old. You'd think like Marius, he doesn't care about, he's had a bunch of commands. No, he's not satisfied yet. These guys are going to be in civil wars when they're like 60 and almost 70 years old. I mean, you're never too old to have power, all right? And these guys kind of prove that. So Sulla goes out to those armies. Some of these guys were loyal to him, and he tells them that he was wronged. And so he marches onto the city. That had never been done before in Roman history. A general marching his legions onto the capital. Marius and his friends flee for their lives, of course, and the ones that don't get out are getting killed, all right? The civil war starts. Sulla still wants to go over and fight Mithridates in Asia Minor. He wants to have those triumphs. He wants to get that money. He just, he wants that reputation. So he leaves, and he leaves his clients back home. Well, Marius comes in and starts to kill them. And like I said, as civil war goes on, Sulla hears about this, has to hurry and finish up the Mithridatic War. That's going to leave it open-ended for another Mithridatic War. He comes back home, finishes off the civil war. During that time, Marius dies of old age. I think one of Marius's kids is killed though. So legalistically speaking, like what does he do that's illegal? Like I said before, marches on Rome. Okay, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to even bear weapons inside the sacred boundary of Rome, the Pomerium. You can't have a sword inside that area. People secretly carried knives and swords all the time, but they weren't supposed to bear arms inside Rome. So of course, having a civil war, killing other Romans, putting them on proscription lists and murdering people without trial, that's illegal. And during this time period, when he's back there finishing off the Civil War, he takes a dictatorship without end. It does last for 3 years, but he basically says, I'm taking the dictatorship until the crisis is over, right? So always be careful when you hear someone saying, well, it's emergency, it's a crisis. Let's let this guy have a little bit more power because it's a crisis. No, never, 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 never. We need to check people even during crises, especially during crises when they think they can get away with trouble, because all these guys are going to use that word, crisis, emergency. I'm here to save the Republic, really. So this is one of the few guys that's going to die as peacefully. He retires, goes home to his villa, and he dies 60 years old. We saw Marius, he died at 71. All right, Pompey. Pompey is going to break all these rules. Yeah, I should go back here real quick. Sulla, one thing Sulla tries to do when he takes over, he's going to try to reset the system of the old republic. He's like, we need to follow the rules. We need to go through the cursus honorum. You have to go through the sequence of offices. You have to be the right age limit. You have to be the right class to have all these positions of power. He's going to reduce the Senate way down. I forget the exact number, but the Senate had over bloated to several hundred. And he wanted to get down to like, I think 300, but I don't think he ever gets to that number. So anyways, he's trying to reset the republic. The problem is all these rules and regulations that he set up for everybody else, he's going to break them for Pompey, his man, his general. Okay. So here's Pompey, takes advantage of the Civil War to gain extraordinary powers. He's not the full senatorial rank yet. He's not the right age yet. This guy is like a kid. He's 19 or 20 years old. His father had been a senatorial class and a general who just died. So he just goes out to where his family's clientele live, and he just says, rise up. And he rises up an illegal army of 18,000 men. That is like ridiculous. Okay, that's 3 legions. He does not have a proper rank. He starts killing off Marius's allies. And Sulla, hears about this. Sulla comes back. Sulla meets him when he brings his forces back from Asia Minor. And he's basically like, who are you, kid? And this guy's like, I'm on your side and I'm killing your enemies. And he's like, yes, you are. And so he gives him commands and more commands. And he's very good at hunting down the enemies of Sulla. He kills many elite men without trial also. I think he kills Brutus's father without a trial. So yeah, the main thing he does here is he takes advantage of the Civil War, and Sulla lets him do it. They called this guy the teenage butcher because he was so good at this. He also asks for a triumph over dead Romans. This had never been happened. Nobody had ever had a parade to celebrate the victory over killing your own people. That sounds pretty ghoulish, but he does it. And he killed way more than 5,000 Romans. All right. He is also involved in the Spartacus revolt. He takes a lot of credit for it, even though Crassus had really finished that off. He's involved in a pirate campaign, one of the largest. There's like 3 or 4 campaigns against pirates over the last 100 years or so of the Republic. His command, he'll have 120,000 men in that command. That was legally given to him. It was controversial because he had power beyond most people, most generals ever. And it's the end of this is when he's going to annex the East. He's going to annex Syria, parts of Asia Minor, maybe even, what is it? Some of the islands out there too. Look at that map that I'd had up last time. You'll see the area that he annexed. What else does he do? He's going to get involved with the first triumvirate. This is Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus. And when this first starts, Caesar's the lowest guy ranked person in that. They're going to need him though, because he's a good speaker. He's young. He's just come back from Spain. He's got a little power. And so they're going to use him. They're going to all use each other. And these are all separate factions, but they have enemies in the Senate, and they're going to pool their money, their power to fight against the other factions, first secretly and then a little bit more openly. It's not technically illegal to be in the triumvirate though. One thing he does technically illegal, well, he'll be elected sole consul for 1 year because there's a bunch of violence in the street. There's political gangs in the street being run by tribunes of the plebs. Some of them work for these guys. There's attempted assassinations or threats on Pompey, even while he is the sole consul, so he kind of hides out. This is all during the time when Caesar's off in Gaul, involved with conquering Gaul, maybe starting some illegal wars. The Senate starts to say, hey, these wars are illegal. He's a war criminal. We need to recall him. They're also doing this because they want to make Pompey go against his old ally. They want to break apart this triumvirate. There's a renewal of the triumvirate. And I can't remember which time, if Pompey, when he marries Caesar's daughter. Okay, Pompey's probably in his 50s and he marries an 18-year-old Julia. The problem is she's going to die in childbirth. The child dies. And so the connection with Caesar and him is broken. Crassus goes off to the east. He dies. So that third person in the triumvirate, the balance, if you will, that's gone. And now the Senate's going to get into and start to wedge into Pompey and say, you don't want to be the second man of Rome. You want to be the first man of Rome. Because at this time he was the most powerful, the most famous. He was the Roman Alexander. But now he's getting older and Caesar's the rising star. So a lot of this has to do with their personal dignitas, pietas, or auctoritas, their authority, okay? And fame and power and money had a lot to do with this. So Caesar is starting to rise up and is going to eclipse him. He doesn't want this, and the Senate is playing him like a fiddle. He was a great general. He wasn't the best politician, and he probably should have been able to realize that he was getting played. But the Senate will make a gamble, and this gamble is going to lead to civil war. It is Caesar's fault that there's a civil war as well, but it's just as much the fault of Pompey and largely the Senate driving these guys apart. They made it impossible for Caesar to come back and have a peaceful resolution. They probably were going to kill him or try him and take away everything he ever had. So the only thing Caesar could do was go to war. So with all these guys, we probably should add in the Senate is causing a lot of these problems too, but they do take advantage of it. All right. So civil war. That's technically illegal too, but I mean, if you win, then you can say it's not illegal. Crassus, real quickly, he gets skimmed over really quickly usually, but he shouldn't, because he's involved with all of these civil wars. I mean, not between Pompey and Caesar, but he's going to help create it. He's definitely involved in the civil war between Marius and Sulla. That's when he becomes very rich. All right. I forget what your book still says, but it says he was involved with property speculation. That's a pretty rated G way of saying that. He owned a private fire department, and what he used to do is go around at night. If your house was on fire, maybe his guy set it on fire, he would offer you half the price or a quarter of the price until you sold your house. And then his guys would come out of the woodwork and put the fire out. He'd own your house. Well, he also did this during the civil wars. He took those prescription lists, basically a list of names that you were allowed to go kill and get a bounty. He'd kill these people. Sometimes he'd get their property, and he would be a property speculator there, and he became very, very wealthy during this time. Also, like I said, the Spartacus revolt, during that, he does reform the military. The military was, getting their ass handed to him during the Spartacus revolt. He has to go out there, decimate some of the legions, like kill 1/10 of some of the men, whip them into shape, and then he goes after the slave rebellion in earnest and starts to destroy them. The problem is, when he's almost done, Pompey's coming back from one of his campaigns from the north, and he ends up whipping up about 5,000 or 6,000 of the slaves, and he kind of takes credit for it, which was kind of made Crassus and him rivals. All right. He's also, as I mentioned, part of the first triumvirate with Pompey and Caesar, and at this point he's got money, but Pompey, coming back from the east, has more money than him now. So this guy had been the richest guy, Pompey's the richest guy, and then they're going to use this money. They want some political things to happen in the Senate, and so Caesar's going to come back and become the consul, and he's going to help push through legislation. This guy wanted legislation for tax farming because he had a bunch of contracts with them. Pompey wanted some settlements for some of his soldiers in the east to get land and other things like this. And so they're going to make a deal. Okay, they don't really like each other necessarily. They're just being pragmatic, politically expedient to get things done. And even if they can't be the consuls together or at different times, they're going to make sure their clients are elected to the consulship. And they're even going to have some poorer gentlemen elected to the consulship. And so we would ask, well, who paid for that? Well, these guys do. Well, who do they owe favors to? These guys, okay? And they're going to do that at various levels, not just the consulship. So these guys are going to kind of help run politics in the Senate for almost a decade or so, all right? What else am I going to say here? So yeah, I did say he gets a Parthian command. He sees Caesar going off to Gaul. Caesar gets 2 5-year terms in Gaul. That's going to get him some time to get wealthy, get some more triumphs, build up his political and military clout. Well, he wants the same thing, but he's going to go east. Crassus is going to try to become the new Alexander of the Romans. He wants to go conquer the new Persian Empire. Well, that's not going to happen. He gets drawn into a trap by the Persians there, the Parthians, and he loses 20,000 legionaries. And he gets to see his son killed right in front of him. Then his head is cut off. 10,000 Roman soldiers enslaved. Many of them might even end up in Western China. There's some archaeological evidence that there were some Roman slaves building very Roman-looking walls in Western China not too long after this time. So there we got Crassus, really with money and corruption, murder, all kinds of things like this. Caesar, we get to the last guy here, Julius Caesar. So a little background of him. Politically, though, he doesn't really break any of the rules until almost the very end of his career. He follows that cursus honorum. He serves 10 years in the military as a young man. He's elected as a quaestor, the financial officer in Rome. Later, he'll be elected to the aedile. Then he's elected to a praetorship. That's when he's, for 1 year, he's in the city of Rome as basically a judge. Then after that, he becomes a pro-praetor, where they send him as a governor to part of Spain, all right? He comes back, and then he's the right age, and he's eligible to run for the consulship. He needs a little bit of money, though. It's very expensive to run for any of these offices. So this is when Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar come together, make that triumvirate, and they're going to help him pay for his election and get their clients to vote for him, all right? And then he's going to pass their legislation that they want, some of it. After he's the consul the first time, then that's when he goes off to Gaul. And he's, like I said, he's given 2 5-year governorships. I didn't say this. Pompey was given a governorship in Spain for the same time limit. He's smart, though. He sends a delegate to go do the job. So he's a governor in absentia, and he stays in Rome to keep his eyes on politics. All right. Well, after Caesar's off in Gaul for about 8 or 9 years, he gets recalled. The Senate's worried because he's becoming really powerful, very rich, and they tell him that he started some of these wars illegally. They want to charge him for war crimes, but they're also they want to knock him down a few pegs. Crassus is going to be dead at this point, it looks like, yes. And Pompey is listening to the Senate. Pompey wants to be the first man. He wants to be the princeps, the first man of Rome, and Caesar's probably going to eclipse him. So they get into his ear, and they get a wedge driven between these two men. Okay, well, Caesar basically realizes when he comes home, he's either going to get killed, he's going to lose his property, he's going to get exiled, he's going to have all these lawsuits against him, and they're putting him basically his back to the wall. And he thinks the only way that he can defend himself, defend basically his ego, his dignity. The Romans would have called it dignity. This is part of their family worship. Okay, you worship the family's dignity. You had piety, pietas to that, and his dignity was affronted. So it sounds kind of weird. It sounds like 2 teenagers going to war over their ego, but it kind of was. All right. Well, we have a very protracted civil war. He comes in, Pompey runs out, leaves with the Senate. They go to Asia Minor, and he basically stamps the ground and says, rise up. 100,000 guys rise up and join his army. The problem is they've been sitting there for 8 or 10 years. They're older. The veterans of Caesar are fresh. There's less of them, but they're fresh. Also, Pompey has a bunch of senators around him that also think they're good generals, and it's not going to work to run an army through kind of a type of democracy. All right. And so Caesar's going to come out on top, barely. He does get lucky, though. All right. So wins the Civil War, comes back home. He's been a dictator a couple times here, set the dictatorship down, trying to make it look all is good and all is normal. When he comes back from the Civil Wars, he's going to be elected dictator again for 10 years. It's renewed. I think it's every year. Then he's going to get it in the middle of that. He'll be made dictator for life. And that's when most of the senators that had surrendered and subjected themselves to it, they're like, no, none of this, because now none of us can really ever be the chief man of Rome. He's taken away the competition. He's taken away our dignity. Okay, so for many of these senators, even guys that have been his allies, start to look at this was necessary to assassinate Caesar. And like Brutus even said, Brutus might have even been his bastard son. He paid for largely this young man to be educated. Brutus's mother was Caesar's favorite mistress or mistress. But when Brutus kills him, people ask him, why did you kill Caesar? And he says, well, I loved Caesar. I just loved the Republic more. So I don't know if he really said that, but he said something to that thing. So these are the things we should look out for as far as criminality. The first dictatorship, maybe not so much, because he does set it down after some reforms. Now, this dictatorship where he gets elected for 10 years, you know, back to back to back, and then for life, definitely he's breaking the rules there, because this is when they start to say in Rome that he wanted to be a king, Rex. That's a dirty word for the Romans. You not want to be called a king. And so they kill him. The problem is the civil wars start back up again, and these civil wars are even worse than the last ones. And we'll get to that next time. So hopefully you guys have some questions, comments on these guys, either this week or next week. Next week, I'm going to open it up to just questions on really part 1, 2, or 3 of Rome. Get creative in there if you want. Watch these, and hopefully you have some questions. So I will probably upload part 3 next week. So look for that, and then we'll get into Augustus and the actual empire. All right.